Welcome to class 2 of Romans. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. So I want to go ahead and jump in. We're going to cover Romans 1:18 through 4:25. Now, obviously that's a lot of text. So what I want you guys to do is to get the big picture of Romans. That's my main goal for this class. But there's a few crucial passages. It feels kind of funny to say that some passages in the Bible are more important than others, but it's true. Some require more time to understand than others. I love that Peter says, Paul's written some things that are hard to understand. It's like, okay, so it's legit. One thing about Peter too, by the way, before we jump in, I mentioned that God uses people like Peter and people like Paul, but I forgot to mention, look at the kind of man Peter became. He could quote scripture like that, and he could exegete it and proclaim it like that. He was unschooled and ordinary, but then he became schooled in the class of Christ and extraordinary. So even the ordinary to start and unschooled becomes schooled. As Paul says, that's not how you learned Christ. You can actually learn Christ. So that's for all the Peters out there who think that you can stay unschooled. Christ will school you. It just might be a different kind of school than you're used to. Okay, so Romans chapter 1, verse 18. We're going to jump into that, but I wanted to just pause and say, what did you come up with for the major sections of Romans? So this is like the big picture. The whole task for this week was to read Romans again and say, what are the 3 to 5 sections? So first of all, who was able to do that this week? To identify, I didn't say successfully, but you tried to identify the 3 to 5 major sections. Okay, most people did. All right. And what did you come up with? Chapters and verses. So what was your first major section?
1 through 17.
Okay. 1 through 17, okay. Who else got that, or who got something different? What did you guys get for your first section? Okay. 1 through 3. What else?
I got 1 through 15.
Okay. 1 through. I love it.
From the beginning to the end of chapter 8. It's like
Okay.
That's the theology part.
8:39, I think it is. Is that right? 1 through 6:11. Okay.
I had 1 through 1:16.
Okay. So we're seeing there's kind of 2 different ways to do it. Just that first little part or chapters. Who else has something they want to contribute to that? As you can see, all answers are fair game. Okay. What about your second section? What'd you come up with?
I divided into 5 sections, just so everybody knows.
Okay.
So if that confuses anybody, but I did 1:18.
Okay. What else? Just shout them out, guys.
Can we go in order again? 'Cause I just
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I want to see.
Yeah.
4 through 8.
You already committed. Okay. Who's next?
1:16 through 11:36.
Okay.
The beginning of 9 to the
Okay.
end of 11.
Okay. There's 36 verses in 11, is that right? All right.
Yes.
And then, yeah, you don't have the verses memorized?
If I knew, I would have said.
Yes. Yeah. 6:12 to 8:39.
6:12 to 8:39. Okay. And last but not least, well, we'll reconsider now.
1:17 through 8:9.
Okay. A diversity of answers. What you're seeing is short, medium, long, but no one goes beyond 11:36. Okay. All right. How about about section 3?
321 through 839.
Okay. Dirk?
9 through 11.
I love it. You're a simple man. You get it done, though. All right.
12:1 through 15:33.
12:1 through 15:33.
9:1 to 11:36. Oh, that's not
Oh,
me.
we already did that one.
Oh my gosh. Hey, whoever did that though, we gotta see.
Yeah.
Who's this?
Yeah,
Huh?
basically the same thing. 12 when he starts talking his travel plan.
Okay, we'll just call it 33 then. And then, Mike, was that you?
Yeah, I had 9:1 to 11:36.
9:1. Oh.
Speaking up.
Ooh. I love it. Chris?
8:10 through 11:10.
Okay. Okay. And for 4.
I did 9 through 11, like everybody else.
Okay. What else? Dirk?
7 through 8.
Oh, 7 through 8. Okay. Okay, Dirk?
10 through.
Wait, you can't go from 9 to 11.
Yeah, gonna get lost. 12 through 15.
12 through 15, okay. Let me guess, 16 is your 5th, okay. And who's
No,
next?
sorry. 16:1 through 17.
Okay. All right.
No, it's 16.
Oh, 16:1
Romans chapter 17.
through,
Yeah.
yeah. Just throw it, it's
Yeah.
similar to Second Imaginations chapter 3, but Paul calls it Romans 17. All right, what's next? Who's next? Who did this one here? Dave, was this you, brother?
Oh, which,
What's your section 4?
it starts at 12, and, yeah, the
Okay.
15, 12 through 15,
Okay, and then next, what's your one after that?
the very end.
Just kind of the end.
Travel plans.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't have the,
All right, and then
other than Romans 8:1, I don't have much of a memory.
And it was 12:1 to 15:13.
and last.
11:11 through 15:13.
Okay. And then we just kind of complete. I'll just do 16, 16. No. No. And then for this one,
12 through 16. Yeah.
12 through 16. Okay.
I'm glad you capped it at 5. 'Cause
Yeah,
that
right.
helps out.
There's a reason for that. Yeah. So big picture. And here's a little hint to my perspective on Romans. By the way, great job. Really good job doing this. You stayed within 5, and that's a huge deal. I was kind of expecting people to break the bounds, but I'm glad you were broken by it, because here's a little hint to my perspective on the structure of Pauline literature. So Pauline is the adjectival form of Paul. And typically, he writes more theological in a big chunk, and then he ends with more practical. So I divide it, I think, in the big sections of 1 to 11 and 12 to 16. But what you did, and I'm especially proud of Chris for challenging that notion that there's a strong divide at 12:1. So that's interesting. And there's a few others who challenge some of those notions as well. But that's part of the process, is figuring out, is my challenge to the typical chapter and verse structure legitimate based on theme and flow? And so you can play with it a little bit, but going into the sandbox without any markers helps you play with it in an authentic, real way. If you end up deciding, no, those are good markers, or hey, I'd tweak it by a verse here or two, here or there, then you know why. So you've dealt with it in an authentic way. So let me share with you. So there's not necessarily a right or, there's probably some wrong ways to divide things up, but it's a matter of perspective, and what I want you to do is kind of work it out as we go through the class. So let me give you what mine are. Mine are 1:1 through 17, which you probably caught on because that's what we covered last week. And then you might have also caught on, and then my second one is 1:18 through 11:36. And then I've got 12:1 through 15:6. And then 15:7 through 16:27. Okay? And let me just kind of go to those junctures to help you understand. The way I titled them was Introduction, the Gospel for the Romans. So one of the things I want you guys to do is to title things, to say, okay, how is his flow of thought moving? So, this is my first time doing this with Romans, by the way, like this formal structuring. So I might play with it a little bit and change my mind later too. But this is where I'm at right now. Then this section is, to me, the theological implications of the gospel. This is practical implications of the gospel. And I used a really technical term, conclusion, for this part. Yeah. Some people call it the travelogue or kind of the ending, but I'm just calling it the conclusion. It includes several parts. Yeah, and in closing. Oh no, here's another 10 minutes of the sermon. And this is kind of, I gave little subtitles to sections 2 and 3 for me. So it's theological implications of the gospel, what to do with our minds in light of the gospel. And this is relational implications of the gospel. Oh, that's what I called it. Yeah, I called it relational implications of the gospel, not practical. And so I said, what to do with our relationships in light of the gospel. And that's how I divided it up. So what your assignment is for next week is to now take, and you could go ahead and change yours to be mine, that's fine, or someone else's, or you could stick with yours and figure out, is that right? But what I want you to do is now to break this into subsections. And by the way, if you got, hopefully when you walked in, you got my outline of Romans 1:18 through 4:25. I emailed it to you this morning, but it's also on Kevin's table there. If you guys want to make sure, there's like 10 of those, so you can share if you need to. But the idea is, what you're going to do this week is do your subsection division. So let's say you end up with 4. Take these 4 major sections and do 3 to 5 subsections of each. Okay? Now, with longer literature, you can also do subsections if you want, but keep that to 3 to 5 as well. I did that because it was helpful for me, because I did a lot of little when I was kind of literally dividing up the Word of God, 2 Timothy 2:15. We need to be thoroughly equipped to rightly divide the Word of God. You're kind of doing that, So I did little tentative tick marks where I thought there were little divisions, and then I went back through and I played with it. And so on your first reading, maybe you did that. Now you can go back and say, okay. Oh, wait, no, I thought those were 2 different groups. It's really one thought there. Boom, that's one little subsection. So that's what you're going to do for each of the major sections. And then, just to kind of go to the syllabus here, just wanted to remind you about the reading. So by next week, you will read Wright's book, chapters 3 to 4. So we read 36 pages last week, or maybe it was a little bit, depending on which version. The old version was 36 pages. Oh, no, I recalculated the page numbers for you guys with the updated version. Then there's 48 pages for this week, so it's 12 more pages. I wanted to give you a good starting week, but also hopefully you've done a lot of the project work for the subsections already. And now you're kind of like, okay, I know what sections are. Okay, you've gotten your feet wet a little bit. So read 48 pages, make your subsection divisions. I'm going to send further instructions on how to do that. And for those of you taking it for credit with your Google Doc, I'm going to actually add that to your Google Doc. So just go in there and use that for your work. Make it easy on yourself. And it does need to be typed. And then after next week, we're going to have a break. So you're going to get 2 weeks in between classes 3 and 4. So that's good. This is good. you're going to have twice as much work because it's 2 weeks. I'm just letting you know. You're still going to work just as hard, but we're not going to have class. And be memorizing your scripture passages. One of them is Romans 3:21-24, and I do recommend memorizing that in the NRSV. There are certain translations with certain passages that I think are superior to others. And this is a case where no matter what you've memorized or what you like, for that one I'm asking you to do NRSV. All right. Let me pause there and just say, any questions about sections or what your assignment is for this week?
I got a question that's related to sex.
Yes, I love you, Dave.
So, having never read a book thinking of structure, like this one struck me a little bit like when we did Ephesians. Like, there's a whole bunch of chapters on theology, and
Yeah.
then there's a whole bunch of instructions for practical. So, are all of Paul's letters kind of that way?
I'll let you. So Dave's question was, does Paul write the same way for every letter? You tell me, man. Test it with all of them. Yeah. But let me give you a hint. You're on to something, my friend. And if one breaks the rule, then you could say, oh, why does he do that differently? So, also, by the way, that's hugely helpful if you think about discipling people. What do they need first? How to or heart? Paul would say, and I think he carries quite a bit of weight in Christianity, heart, meaning mind. Okay, the Hebrew heart includes the mind. The Hebrew concept of heart includes the mind. Disciple people at a belief level first. Then work it out with them practically. I try and give people my Your Spiritual Formation Plan book. So it's all these like practical tips on how to grow. It don't work with people who believe lies about the gospel. So don't worry, and that's my biggest problem when Christians advocate that our primary task, and some Christians act like our primary task is to put a law on the society. And that's how we fix the morality and the brokenness of the world. Look, I actually think laws can be great. And in Romans 13, we're going to find out exactly why. But it's so limited. That doesn't convert people. That slaps people on the wrist at best. When I was in high school, the hockey league, there were 16 teams in Nashville, high school hockey teams, and Franklin High started in the year 2000. I was on the inaugural team. And in one of the first, I think it was 2 or 3 years, they wanted to come down with the legislation on the hockey team and say no one's allowed to smoke weed. Or I think it was do drugs, but everyone knew like the main one that high schoolers are struggling with was weed. And they actually printed out a document and made everyone sign it. I will not like do drugs. Right? And I'm laughing because it was like, yeah, that's going to work. And you know what was interesting? I remember my dad. So my dad founded the Franklin High ice hockey team in the year 2000. Because we're Canadian, man. We got to bring it to the South. For which I was very grateful. But my dad's response to that was actually like, I don't think you should do that to these kids. You're making them lie. And I think that's right. And so we're going to get into some of that principle about what does the law do? Metaphorically and the Jewish law, the Torah. So there's our little prelude to today. Let me take a step back and I want to talk about approaches to Romans because today is a challenging lesson. Today's passage is really difficult. And so I was just praying to the Lord on the way here, like, Lord, would you be honored by our attempts to understand your word? Just trying our best. Would you be honored in that? And I'm humbled by attempting to teach this text. So let's all, with humility, try and go up further so we can see further the radiance of God's gospel. Does that sound good? And the implications of the gospel. So there's traditional approaches to Romans that I just want to acknowledge before I challenge some of them. Because I think that sometimes a challenge is worthy traditional approaches to Romans, and by that I mean really the last 500 years. Some of the approaches go back maybe 1,700 years. Okay, so these are deeply ingrained for Protestants. That one approach to Romans is just thinking about Romans on a macro level and at a thematic level as some sort of tract on how to get saved. Have you ever heard of the Romans Road? You know, you start in the beginning, then you go to for all of sin and fall short of the glory of God in Romans 2:23, and then Romans 3:23, and then you go to 6. They made it easy to remember. 6:23, and then you lead people. I've used the Romans Road to tell people how to get saved. That's not why Romans was written, I can confidently say. And to use it for that, you can do worse things with the Bible than use the Bible out of context to help someone get saved. There's worse things you can do, right? But there's also better things you can do. And so I would say that the Romans Road God has used, despite our taking Romans out of context of itself on the macro picture level. Despite that, I think that we should say, okay, but what did St. Paul really say? There's also this notion of imputed and imparted righteousness, that we're all sort of like, okay, the righteousness of God, we know that that's either imparted or imputed righteousness, so which one is it? As you'll see on page 117 in What St. Paul Really Say, what did St. Wright says there's actually 8 things that the righteousness of God could mean, and only 2 of them are imputed and imparted righteousness. So I'm just telling you that there's more options than just that. If you don't know what imputed and imparted righteousness are, then just don't worry about that for now. I'm just telling you that that's where some of you may be coming from. There's also this notion, if you have grown up in the church, in evangelical circles, you're probably familiar with this notion that justification, of course we all know, means salvation. It's just a fancy word for that. But that's not the case. If you take the Bible at its word and you look at the place of justification, it's definitively not equal with salvation. Not only is it a different word, but it is juxtapositioned, not against, but as different than, specifically those 2 concepts. Also, and so the idea is that justification is part of the salvation process. The analogy N.T. Wright uses in his book Justification is that justification is the steering wheel, but there's the whole car there. And by focusing only on the steering wheel, we can put things out of sorts and we can get kind of mixed up. So there's more to a car than a steering wheel. Yeah.
I've heard justification phrased as just as if. Wondering what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're going to get into it. We're just kind of amping up, getting ready here. So yeah, thank you for that thought. The other one is that Romans is written for individuals. So when you think about predestination, you're going to read that in terms of the individual. When you think about election, you're probably going to read it as God elects certain individuals. Or sin, that there's just individual sin and not collective sin. That the covenant is really just between you and God, or that justification itself is really just something God does for the individual. But the notion that I want to propose for that one is that actually in a collectivist culture, also known as a dyadic culture, the individual is not the primary sort of personality of the culture. The collective is. The group identity. It doesn't mean that the individual doesn't exist or doesn't matter. It's just that they thought primarily, kind of instinctually, in terms of a group. So in English, we struggle with this because the word you can mean you plural or you individual, but in Greek, oftentimes, it's more nuanced than that.
Are they 2 separate words? Like you can easily distinguish a plural
You can, but then sometimes there's the you all individuals, which is still plural, but so it's nuanced. I'm just saying it's clearer, but it's not always definitively evident. Yeah, sometimes it'll be like, like all y'all. That's the Greek. I translate, yeah, but it says all y'all in Greek. So anyway, it's kind of amazing that Greek and English in the South, we're the same. Yeah. So I just want to say, if those are where you're coming from, I understand where you're coming from. I've been there. And I just want to propose some tweaks to your understanding based on what the Bible actually says and other evidence. So I'm not just going to say, hey, this is what it is, just believe something different. I want you to journey with me and be convinced. Because if you're not actually convinced of things, you're not going to really believe them. So that's my job, is to work it out with you. Okay? So if you're like, Chad, how this and why that, and let's go there. I want that. That's the value of especially coming in person. For those of you online, live, shoot your questions, man. Like, I'm out. I'm not going to study under you anymore, Chad. Please don't do that. Give me a chance. I want to give you a chance too. Why don't we do this together? A more raw approach to Romans is this. I was just kind of saying, looking at the data. I want to say every person is flawed, and no single person in history has it all right. Martin Luther had it all right, man. What if Martin Luther was wrong about some things? What if John Calvin was wrong about some things? No! Okay, they were right about a lot, right? So, for you to think you're always right about everything, we know is arrogant. For me to think I'm right, but what about the people in history that we've trusted? Let's just say, what does the Bible actually say? And so, I think it's helpful to think about this hypothesis that Romans is not about how to get saved at all. And here's the basic reason. He's writing to people who are already saved. So why would he give them instructions on how to get where they already are? What if Romans is actually about how to be the church in light of the gospel and its implications for our lives? In other words, what I want to propose to you is that the question Paul is answering, the problem Paul is solving, is actually more about the topic of what's called ecclesiology, the church, and less about soteriology, salvation. I think he's asking a different question than we traditionally have believed in the last while that he's asking. I think he's asking the question, who belongs at the table as legitimate members of the covenant that's been newly formed apart from the law under the banner of Jesus? Who's welcome at the table as equal members of the covenant that's been newly formed under the banner of Jesus? The answer you get really depends on the question that's being asked. And if we ask the wrong question, then no matter what answer we give, we're already in the wrong ballpark. So I want to start by saying, what is Paul asking here? And that's why I want you to read Romans as a whole. Does that start to sit well? I'm not saying you got to commit to what I'm saying, but does that start to sit well when you think about, hey, I read Romans and you know what? That sounds a little bit more right than I thought. There's this Jew-Gentile thing. Well, if that's just sort of a footnote or like a side note, then why is it vital to his very argument all throughout, especially those first 12 chapters? So it's not primarily about salvation and how to get saved, but it's about the church and how to be the church in light of the gospel that gave us salvation. So, let's look at, over the next hour, we're going to look at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 425. And I just want you to test it. Work it out. Work this thesis out. What question is Paul asking, and what sort of answers are we getting already? So, I've given you my outline of these chapters. So this is the reason I'm providing this for you. And by the way, it's the handout that you got and I emailed to you, or that you can download online. The reason I'm giving this to you is because I want you to see how subsections can go. So when you go to do your subsections this week, you could either do mine or you could say, hey, I see it a little different, and that's all right. But at least you've got an example of what one subsection looks like. So as you can see, I've divided, my major section is actually 1:18 through 11:36. And Romans, I'll just call it 1 to 4, is just one subsection of that. And so I've got subsections to my subsection, okay? Now mine's more detailed than you need to make yours, but you can at least see an example of 3 tiers of outlining. Tracking with me? Try not to go beyond 4 unless you're teaching it. But that way you can think on the 3 levels. So Romans 1 to 18, Romans 1:18 through 3:18 is my first subdivision of this subsection. Okay? And I'm calling it gospel potential. God judges Jew and Gentile equally as sinful. Okay? Then from 3:19 to verse 27, I'm calling gospel realized. God judges Jew and Gentile equally as justified apart from law through Jesus' faithfulness. And then 3:28 through the end of 4, I think I meant to put 4:25, I'm calling gospel equality. This justification of faith is anchored in Torah from the beginning. So in other words, it can be tempting to be like, oh yeah, in Romans chapter 4, that's just about Abraham. Like, it's kind of irrelevant. We really got our justification stuff from Romans 3 and we're good. But the truth is, it's this cohesive section that I would call as a whole, what did I call this as a whole? What to do with righteousness now that all failed to uphold the law in light of the gospel? What to do with, so today's class is, in my terms, is what to do with righteousness now that all failed to uphold the law in light of the gospel. So what do we do about this thing called righteousness? And what is this righteousness? So let's jump in. I'm going to read this text here. Okay? 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness. And this is the NRSV. So 1:18. Of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Okay, so this is, what I'm saying is all people have worshiped creation and become creatures. They've become what they worshiped. So they were without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. They became like the things they worshiped. And their senseless minds were darkened. Sounds like Gen Z on TikTok at their worst. At their best, they can actually pay attention to something longer than 59 seconds. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. The best we can do is create things that do not transcend our existence. Therefore, God gave them up in their lusts to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Again, discipling people at the level of truth and belief is where Paul's saying you've believed lies. And worshipped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see it fit, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. In other words, God said, have at it, if that's what you want.
Would that be considered hardening? Would that be fit the theme of God?
That's a,
Hardening?
yeah, I need to think on that. I don't know. I mean, at a minimum,
Prelude to what he's going to follow up on?
yeah, I think there's truth in that. I think at a minimum, God's being a good parent. And good parents let their kids have what they want so that they can figure it out. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. In other words, it's more than just a bodily sin. It's more than just a slip up or a mess up. Categorically, they say, yeah, that's good and okay. Now that is depravity. All people have worshiped creation and become creatures. Now let's get into a little more. Therefore, chapter 2, verse 1. You have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. And this is what I call Gentile law, in quote marks, is insufficient for justification. That's this next section for me. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with the truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? He's talking primarily to Gentiles apart from the law. Okay, so what I want you to notice and think about is a narrative substructure to the way that Paul is writing. Okay, so he's starting with creation. And if you follow his train of thought, he hasn't mentioned law, really. So he's actually kind of talking to everybody in that place in history. Think about it like that. So I wouldn't say that this is Gentiles directed. I would say this is everybody if you pretend that we're before the law ever came in history. He's kind of speaking to all of us as though we were in a certain time, okay? So it's interesting that Paul thinks on that complex level. But test that. He follows the narrative substructure through what they call salvation history all the way through Romans 8.
Is he exchanging the truth of God for a lie and worshiping the creature rather than the creator?
Which verse is that?
Verse 25, chapter 1, verse 25. Is that like an Edenic reference, you think? Like listening to the serpent?
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I think it could be.
You're talking about like,
Yeah, I mean the law. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the essence of sin, starting in the garden, is believing a lie. So yeah, I think you can make that connection. Chapter 2, verse 5. But by your hand and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. For he will repay according to each one's deeds, to those who by patiently doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. While for those who are self-seeking, and who obey not the truth but wickedness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. Okay? All who have sinned apart from the law, verse 12, will perish apart from the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. When Gentiles, who do not possess the law, do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God, through Jesus Christ, will judge the secret thoughts of all. Confused yet?
You're just saying, it's kind of like ingrained in your DNA to know right from wrong.
I think that's part of it. It's more complex than that, though. So, surprise, right? So far, chapter 1, the second half of chapter 1 is, hey, all people are equally accused and in need. Now we're in chapter 2, and he's basically talking about what I would call the Gentile law. Think about chapter 2, verses 1 through 16 as the Gentile law. Gentile is a word that means just the nations. Okay, and we were all the nations at one point. Even Abraham was a part of the Gentiles. It was kind of part of his argument. So, 2:12 through 16, he says, basically, not hearers but doers are the ones who will be justified. Well, isn't that anti-Romans, right? How are doers of the law justified? Isn't he saying like the opposite of that next chapter? So what do we do with that, Colin? So there's three options for this section of Romans 2:12 to 16 of what it could mean, because that's an important question. Is he being facetious? Meaning, is he being hypothetical and kind of saying, hey, this is kind of what you try and do, but we know you can't do it, right? Okay? So that's one option. But the language there isn't obviously hypothetical. So that's the interesting part. The second option is you actually can do righteousness and be justified. You could do the works and be justified. But that would imply that people are sinless. So that answer doesn't quite qualify. And by the way, these are coming from N.T. Wright's big commentary on Romans. The third option is more likely, but it also has some challenges. So either way, we're challenged. And this is what I think it's talking about. That this section is actually talking about Jew and Gentile Christians who, as he will redefine Torah and redefine righteousness and justification, actually are justified by doing Torah. He's going to unpack that. He literally says that, right? So we have to say, what does he mean by that? The doers of the Torah are justified. We have to understand what that means. It's not me saying that. That's what Paul says. What does it mean? And it is possible that he actually means that that Christian Gentiles, especially in this context, because we're going to get to Jews in a second, are justified by doing Torah. Well, what does that doing Torah mean? And it's like it says do law. I'm going to make an argument that every time law is used, unless it's a clearly metaphorical usage, means Torah in Romans. So I'm going to make that case for you.
So, you wouldn't have started early on in the class saying, correctly my thinking, where justification does not equal salvation.
Mm-hmm.
I would object to all that.
Uh-huh.
But now I don't. 'Cause
Okay.
now that makes sense.
Okay, good. So you got to kind of hold some of these thoughts in tension while we're going along. It's like, whoa, rocking the boat. I'm not trying to rock the boat. I'm trying to understand this with you. So there's one important phrase that we kind of need to unpack, but it says, when Gentiles, verse 14, who do not possess the law, do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law unto themselves. What Gentiles do you know do what the Torah requires? Instinctively. Yeah, people don't do that, do they? There's a legitimate translation of instinctively do instinctively, meaning not do instinctively, but some of your translations might have like who naturally. It actually could be that Gentiles who naturally don't possess the law. In other words, when you're born a Gentile, you don't have the Torah. They are a law unto themselves in a different way. That's one translation of that phrase. So the main thing that I want you to walk away from this is that Paul is trying to redefine how they think about justification and Torah, and that it also says, it doesn't say that they have, kind of going back up to verse 7, it says, so categorizing this as Christian Gentiles, says, to those who patiently doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. So if what I'm saying is true, that he's talking about Gentile Christians, God gives eternal life to those who seek for glory, honor, and immortality. It's not just it doesn't mean that they've arrived. They're seeking for. And if you're like, well, you don't have to seek for those things to be saved, I would say, why not? Do saved people not seek after those things? It's the characteristics of a person who has been converted to Christ, who seeks for glory, honor, and immortality. Yes, definitively, disciples do that. Is that the reason God gives them eternal life? No. God does it because of his grace. You see what I'm saying? So it can get kind of tricky. So hang with it when you're like, ooh. Okay, 2:17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law. Okay, now we're changing tone here. So we've kind of transitioned to more talking about those who call themselves Jews. So the Roman church had two people sitting in the pews, and maybe they were on other sides of the auditorium or the living room. He's like, okay, now you who call yourselves Jews, notice he doesn't call them Jews. He says, you call yourselves Jews. But what is a Jew is kind of what he's implicitly saying. And rely on the law and boast of your relation to God. Do you know people like that? Not ethnic Jews, but people who are like, well, I grew up in the church, so I'm good. I went to camp one time, to FCA camp, leadership camp, when I was a sophomore in high school. And they broke up into little small groups, and our little camp leader for the week asked everyone where they were from and kind of something about themselves. And I said, I'm Chad, I'm from Franklin. And, I mentioned, like, my dad's a pastor or something. And I don't think there was another guy like me there, too. And the guy said, and just so you guys know, I'm most concerned this week for the pastor's kids. Yeah. So if you grew up in the church, Paul's talking to you. But if you call yourself a devout, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know his will and determine what is best, because you were instructed in the law, and if you were sure that you were a guide, he's giving things that are actually the vocational call of Israel. But he's being tongue-in-cheek because he's saying, all right, all y'all, how you doing with this? And what he's not doing is saying, you have not done this, and he's saying as a whole, as a group. Because not all of them commit every one of them, okay? And if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then, that teach others, will you not teach yourself? Will you preach against stealing? Do you steal? You that forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Blaspheming in the name of God is just taking it from high and making it low. Circumcision indeed is of value, okay? We're not going to land here for very long. I'm going to kind of fly through this. Circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision has been uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code and circumcision but break the law. In other words, he's leveling the playing ground. He's trying to say, hey, look, there's people who aren't circumcised over here, and they're kind of showing you up. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly. Okay, now he's redefining what it means to be the people of God. Nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Should you take the Bible literally? Yes. Even if literally means taking it metaphorically or spiritually. Such a person receives praise not from others but from God. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. Ah, Paul, you just said it doesn't matter. But it kind of matters. For in the first place, okay, now he's going to explain himself. For in the first place, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Hey, the heritage matters. God's not duplicitous. He didn't change his mind. And the first covenant was his first idea, and he's like, that didn't quite work out. Let's try a new covenant. No, you were entrusted with the very oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Will their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? Faithlessness nullify? Yeah. By no means. Although everyone is a liar, let God be proved true as it is written, so that you may be justified in your words and prevail in your judging. But if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? That God is unjust and to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way, he says. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my falsehood God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not say, as some people slander us, by saying that we say, let us do evil that good may come? Their condemnation is deserved. Okay, he unpacks this more in chapter 6. What then? Are we any better off as Jews? No, not at all. Okay. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin, as it is written. And he goes into some verses to make his point clear. Verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. In other words, he uses the law to convict the people under the law. And he says, all y'all. Okay? So now we're all indicted. We're all on the dock. We're all under trial. Now we know that whatever the law, verse 19 says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For, quote, no human being will be justified in his sight, unquote, by deeds prescribed by the law, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Okay, so part of the purpose of the law was to just state that ain't right. Now, for Gentiles, there's a certain sense in which we know, apart from the law, that ain't right. All y'all have this that ain't right thing in your life. But now, the gospel realized. So, we had gospel potential. Didn't work out for you, did it? To be your own king, to be the people of God. The question at issue so far, the question at hand so far has been, were you able to be the people of God? Gentiles, you had a law unto yourselves. You kind of knew what was right and what was wrong. How'd that work out for you? Didn't work, did it? Jews, I mean, look, you had the T-ball hit. You didn't even have to stand there and wait for the ball to be thrown. You could just hit it. No home run though, man. It didn't work out for you, did it? You failed to be the people of God. Did that nullify God's faithfulness? No. Conclusion, verse 21. But now, apart from law, as I've just defined it, which covers everybody, Jew and Gentile alike, the righteousness of God has been disclosed. The final act has begun. And it is attested by the law and the prophets. It's not like he's starting from scratch. The Gentile inclusion, the ideal conquering of the world goes back all the way to Genesis chapter 12, at least. When God says to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation, and every family unit on earth will be blessed in you. Verse 22, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. That is the righteousness of God. It's through Jesus. In other words, Jesus is the game changer. Isn't that beautiful to finally read Jesus Christ has been unveiled, who is the righteousness of God. Oh, finally there's hope. There's one who could be faithful. There's one who showed us what it means to be the people of God. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and that he makes righteous or justifies or puts to right the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes a boasting? Is it excluded? By what law? By that of works? No, but by the law of faith. Okay, there's a metaphorical use of law that does not mean Torah. Okay? For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. Okay? We're going to come back to these. I just want you to read the whole rest of the chapter with me. For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works. So again, faith and faithfulness are legitimate translations of that Greek word. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? By the way, have you ever said the same thing over and over again to your kids? Yeah. You a kid, man. We're all kids. He's repeating himself. Yes, of Gentiles also. Emphasize much? Since God is one, I love that. God is unified. He shows no partiality. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. God is one, Deuteronomy 6 says. The gospel has always been in seed form from the beginning. And he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faith and the uncircumcised through the same faith. So there's the level playing field so that God can do the one thing for all of the people. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. Oh, man, I thought I had it. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Okay, so we'll get into that in a second. But I want to pause here because this is the main point of Romans right here. Okay? So we better understand it because he's basically saying, here's the storyline. So the key terms, there's 5. Righteousness of God, law, faith, justification, or justified, also known as make righteous, and works. The background, as you'll read in Wright's book, is the Hebrew law court language, primarily. Okay? Where there's a plaintiff, and there's a defendant and a judge. Okay? And everyone's on the docket. These are just key terms in what we in Romans 3 at the end here. Yeah, I emailed it late this morning. So we've got the judge. We've got the judge here, who's God. And you've got the plaintiff, and who's bringing the charge. I'm going to just say charger. And the defendant. Who is defending. Okay? So that's us. We're right here. And God's the judge. Who's bringing the charge? Well, in a sense, it's just kind of an implicit charge. You could say that God is. But what is the righteousness of God? That's the first term that comes up. But this is important, right? Because we need to keep this image in mind. I want you to hold this in mind. Because the question is who is justified? So who's being accused of what, and how's that settled? So we're talking about the righteousness of God first. But now, apart from law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed. So there is a sense in which the law was the beginning of God's covenant with his people. Now, he covenanted before that, but there's this like big moment where they get the Torah. Torah is short for saying the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay? So there's 2 main options of what righteousness can mean. Okay? It can mean God's righteousness, or it can mean ours that he gives to us. So it can mean God's own righteousness, or it can mean the righteousness that comes from God. So it's God's righteousness for us. And a lot of times we'll read, there's been a righteousness from God, and now it's ours, right? A lot of times we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 for that. So which one is it? So these are the 2 biggest bucket terms that you'll see in Wright's book. But what I want to do is give you kind of the nugget of what I think it means. So this comes in the context that righteousness is used in Romans 29 times. The noun righteousness in English, in the NRSV. 6 times of God, 8 times of Abraham, 3 times of Christ, 8 times of Christians. These are in your notes. 4 times of Jews and Gentiles. Okay? But what does the righteousness of God actually mean? Let's go to Psalm 143 as an example. I'll just go ahead and tell you. So this would be, this part right here, righteousness of God would be imputed imparted righteousness. But I'm making an argument that the righteousness of God is actually God's own righteousness to fulfill his covenant. In other words, righteousness is a very general, broad term. And we can make it mean anything we want it to. It's like, righteous, dude. Like someone just like did a great move on a surfboard, right? Or maybe they like plummeted and that was righteous, man, because it was amazing. Like we can make the word righteous mean just about anything we want it to mean. It can mean your piousness, like how righteous you are. But what does the righteousness of God mean in the Bible? That's the question. So just read with me sort of anecdotally, because we don't want to just sort of make it say what we want it to mean. And the most important background I think Paul makes clear is the Bible, the Old Testament. He quotes not just from the Torah, but from the rest of the Old Testament. So this is Psalm 143. Hear my prayer, O Lord, David says. Give ear to my supplications in your faithfulness. Answer me in your righteousness. God, you've made promises that you will sustain your people. This is King David speaking. Things aren't looking good. The enemies are having their way. Be faithful, God, to your promise. Answer me in your righteousness. His righteousness is tied to his faithfulness to his covenant. Do not enter into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. That's where he just came from, right? Nobody is righteous. No one is faithful. For the enemy has purged me, crushing my life to the ground, making me sit in darkness like those long dead. Therefore my spirit faints within me. Then you keep going. Verse 7, answer me quickly, O Lord. Verse 8, let me hear of your steadfast love in the morning, your chesed, your covenant faithfulness. Save me, verse 9, from my enemies. Verse 11, for your name's sake, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring me out of trouble. In your steadfast love, cut off my enemies and destroy all my adversaries, for I am your servant. The righteousness of God is a covenantal term for how God was true and right to the promises he made. It's not all the things you can mean by righteousness. It's specifically God being true to his covenant promise. That's the righteousness of God that's been revealed in Jesus, is that finally there was one righteous. There was one without sin who was faithful. In other words, if you look at all the Torah, even though the ethnic Jews could not fulfill it, there was one. And Jesus didn't just do the things that Israel was to do. He actually did the things that God was to do, which is to redeem, Israel from her enemies. The presupposition there is that the Jews had not come back from exile. Yeah, physically they came back, but they were still ruled by the Romans. I mean, no one would have said, we're completely liberated. That's why you had the Zealots. That's why you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's why you had the Sicarii, the assassins. They were looking for the justice of God. Remember, righteousness and justice in Greek are the same word. They wanted things to be put to right. They wanted things to be how God covenantally said they would be, but they weren't. But now, apart from Torah as a badge of inclusion as the people of God, apart from that, a righteousness, a faithfulness of God has been made known through Jesus. And what about Jesus? So I've given you notes on why I think law means Torah, but let me just summarize that and then we'll get into the faith. Law does not mean Roman governmental law. So there's this word namas that I'm talking about that we translate law. So apart from law, okay, it's clearly not Roman governmental law. It's often associated with Jewish commandments, and I think the best meaning is Torah because, so basically what you can do is go do a word study, just look up law in Romans and test this. If you just replace it with Torah, does it work? Does it make sense? So that would be, then I've listed in your notes the times it's used metaphorically. Every other time it works. Okay, so the righteousness of God has been made known, okay, through Jesus. Back to Romans chapter 3 here. Verse 22, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, okay? So just a reminder, so this is a little challenging. So faith can mean faithfulness too. Faith in Jesus can also be translated the faithfulness of Jesus.
Is this Christian thing that everybody talks about?
Yeah. Okay. So it can be faith in Jesus or faithfulness of Jesus. Okay. And I actually, when you do a linguistic analysis of what's called, okay, so it goes back, it's the same kind of point. Righteousness of God, is it God's righteousness or the righteousness of God for us? It's faith of Jesus is kind of a wooden way to say it. Faith of Jesus. Okay, so it'd be like saying, let's see. Yeah. it's tough to explain it unless you're familiar with Greek, but I just want you to know there's two options there. And we have it in English, okay? And it's the same thing when you say of. So faith of Jesus or faithfulness in Jesus. And so I just want you to test it. I'm going to read the passage with faithfulness of Jesus and see if it makes sense to you, all right? So you can't play with the Word of God. Yes, I can.
Which verse? Sorry.
So we're going to do 21. I'm just going to read 21 and forward. But now apart from Torah, I'll just play with a couple things at the same time. But now apart from Torah, the covenant faithfulness of God has been revealed and attested by the Torah and the prophets. The covenant faithfulness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They are now, okay, and we'll keep going. So here's my best argument for why it's the faithfulness of Jesus. Because it's redundant to say immediately after that, for all who believe. So it is faith in Jesus, but he already says that later. So he's playing with things a little bit. He's saying, and this goes back to Romans chapter 1, from faith to faith. It's from the faithfulness of Jesus to our faith. It's like, well, Jesus doesn't have faith. He's the one we put our faith in. Aha! Biblically speaking, God, Psalm 143, has this obligation to be faithful to his covenant. Jesus acted on behalf of Yahweh to be faithful to himself. For us. Because we couldn't do it. So we are justified not by our faith in and of itself. It's kind of like, you're not justified because you believe in justification. Doctrinally. You're justified because Jesus. And this was hugely liberating for me. I had this existential crisis for like a decade or more in my life. My faith needed to be just right because that's what saved me. Well, first of all, it's what justified me. But that's apart from the matter.
That really helps, Judge.
I was like, I got to get my thoughts right. I got to do these mental gymnastics, and I got to hold them there because that's what's going to get me into heaven. One night I was staying up late. This was a true crisis of faith for me. I was terrified that I was going to lose my salvation one day. And I was up in bed, and I started to believe this terrible lie that if I went to sleep that night and didn't figure this out, I would indeed lose my salvation one day. So I got up and I went downstairs. And I was like, what am I gonna do? And my dad was up. And I told my dad what was going on, and he helped me work through it. I want to do that for you. I want to liberate you from the idea that you've got to get your faith just right to be saved. When did your faith, that mental work you do in your head, ever save you? That's a lie. Your faith qualifies you to be saved by Jesus, but it's by grace you've been saved. Through faith. Your faith is not the means by which you're saved. It's the mechanism through which you are qualified in Jesus. He's the one who saves you, not you. Nothing you do, even what goes on up here. Now that's sovereignty. There's a word for making faith a work. It's called fideism. Fides is the word in Latin for faith. And if you make faith into a work, it's actually a form of legalism and false gospel. And I'm afraid that we've believed false gospels like that. I have. The real gospel is that Jesus is king. And what that means is he did on behalf of the people of God what God always was meant to do and we could never do. He is king. We don't have to be. Our faith says, I'm attached to that guy. And he saves. He justifies. He glorifies. He calls. He predestines. He does all that good stuff. And yeah, I'm associated with that guy. That's what faith does. If salvation is a boat of which justification is a part. Our faith is the leap of desperation to be saved, but he's the one doing the saving. You tracking with me? Coming back to justification. So the faith and faithfulness dynamic. Play it out. Test it. Try it out. There's other times in Romans and Galatians where this comes up. And it's especially clear in Galatians. It's very redundant, Galatians 2, where he says the same kind of thing. You're, justified by faith in him for all who believe. It's like, you just said that. Okay? Justified. What does it mean to be justified? This is the case that N.T. Wright makes, and I'll let you read more about it. There's a whole chapter on it. But to be justified comes back to what are we on the docket about? What's the question here? Is the question, how do you get saved? Do you have enough righteousness to get saved? That's not the question. The question is, was Israel and the Gentiles apart from Israel with their own law faithful to the law? No. So to be justified is not about getting saved, but about being the people of God. Hey, Jews, you guys weren't faithful to the law. We're not trying to earn our salvation here. That's not the question. The question is, who are legit? And justification is the declaration that because of Jesus, all y'all are legit for those who believe. All y'all are welcome at the table because of Jesus. And he was faithful, and he shows us how to do Torah. He shows us how to be faithful. And so let's be faithful. The problem for the Jewish constituent of the church was that they had a different banner. And so this gets into works. Romans 3:27. Then what becomes of boasting? Is it excluded by what? The law? By that of works? Okay, so I want to challenge your notion of what works means, because works typically means deeds in our kind of thoughts. Like, oh, you don't work for your salvation, you receive it as a gift. That's not what works means in Romans or Galatians. Works is shorthand for the things you do associated with Torah. And I've given you some of the data in my notes, but there's kind of 4 different meanings that it could mean. So it's not deeds. What could it mean then? It could be general moral principles. Again, that's kind of what I was saying here. That's number 1. Number 2, it could be badges of identity for Jews. So it'd be like wearing a badge on your shirt and be like, we've got works of Torah. We do Sabbath, circumcision, and dietary restrictions. You don't, so you're out. And they're like, see, I'm better than you. I was in Cyprus and I went to this Islamic prayer meeting. So I didn't pray with them. No, it was an Islamic Quran reading. Sorry. I did accidentally go to a prayer meeting. They were all bowing. That was another story. I didn't bow. But I went to this Islamic Quran reading, and the reader was a friend of my friend's. And literally rolled up in this nice car, opens the door, and he was dressed in all white. He steps out, and he was familiar with who I was. By the way, I was like the only American around. And he looked at me and he goes, I'm better than you because I'm a Muslim. Now, most people will not say that out loud. But it was his moment of glory, my friends. But that's what we say sometimes in not so many words. And that's what I believe the Jews were saying. Number 3, it could mean all the practices of the Torah. So number 2 was just these 3 primary ones. Or it can mean all the practices of Torah. Or it can just mean, number 4, a general attitude associated with Torah that manifests itself in different ways. I believe that it's a mixture of 2 through 4. But primarily Jews said, hey, we're circumcised, which was a funny thing to talk about publicly. But for them, that was a way of saying, we have the covenant. Remember, circumcision wasn't an arbitrary incision. It was about the covenant. they also said, hey, by the way, oh, we don't eat that. That's their way of saying we're better than you. And when you're at the table in the church and you've got people saying I'm better than you because I don't eat that, you need to be like me. We have God's oracles. You're asking for trouble, man. So I want to convince you, though, that works is shorthand for works of Torah, not just good deeds. And that's a big difference. So you can read some of the first century Greco-Roman and Jewish evidence from outside the Bible in my notes. But if you just do a word study of works in Romans, just take the NRSV, for example, you'll find that there's this principle of first mention. And the first time that works is mentioned is right here. And it's associated with works of law closely. So it's by what law? By that of works? No, but by the law of faith. And so just go through Romans next time you read, or when you come up, just replace it with the things that Jews would do because of the Torah. We're not called the people of God because we have these badges that are ethnocentric. The way that they would wear them was ethnocentric. Okay? That's not what makes us the people of God. Jesus makes us the people of God. That's Paul's point when he says it's not by works, which is totally different. Okay? So works is short for works of Torah. All right.
So is justification, you would think about it like, I'm trying to find a good English word, but almost like legitimization into the covenant people.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah, translators have had a really hard time figuring out how to say it.
It's a way that you actually are, I don't know, yeah, it's hard to say, like you're in the covenant people
Yeah.
by justification.
Yeah, so
Apart from being a Jew or Gentile.
yeah. Oh, okay, so let's go back to this. And we're going to, I just want to hit on Romans 4. I really want to spend more time in it, but I want you guys to understand Romans 3. There's one thing from Romans 4 that I think is really important to go to your question, Cody. So what he does in Romans 4 is he basically goes back and he says, is the law null and void because of Jesus then? He's like, no. Or sorry, that's the end of 3. What do we do with Abraham then? And he uses Abraham not just as an arbitrary example, but as the father of all who have faith. So remember, Abraham was actually a Gentile. And so people would say, the Jews would be like, well, we have Abraham as our father. And Paul's like, yeah, but even he was a Gentile. So gotcha. And he was justified. It was credited to him as righteousness. But I want you to go back. What's the question in Genesis 15, which is where Paul is quoting from? Is the question in Genesis 15 how Abraham is going to be saved? He wasn't even asking that question. People back then didn't wonder what they were going to do when they were going to die. They wanted to become great on earth. God takes that, makes that true in his sense, and adds life everlasting. So if you go all the way back to Genesis 15, that ain't the question at all. The question is, how's this going to work out? Remember, Abram was already old by this point. After these things, Genesis 15:1, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. So he'd already promised him greatness. Don't be afraid. I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Abraham said, oh, Lord, what will you give me? I still don't have a kid, and the best I got here is my servant Eliezer. And Abraham said, you have given me no offspring, and so a slave born into my house is to be my heir. So what's your plan here? Your plan for what? Your plan for the covenant. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. No, one, but your very own issue, like your very own seed, shall be your heir. And he brought him outside, and he said, look toward heaven and count the stars if you can. And he says, so shall your descendants be. And it says that Abram believed God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. And that's Paul's argument to say, hey, this is same. Well, he believed God about what? The covenant. The covenant faithfulness of God. So then when we are, reckoned to him as righteousness, also known as justified, righteousness, justified, reckoned to him as just, we're struggling for the word there, reckoned to him as covenant faithfulness in a sense. It was his faith. So if God's judging, we're all here, and God says guilty. He does a big guilty. But Jesus. Because of Jesus and your association with Jesus, you can be reckoned as a part of the covenant members of God, just like Abraham was. Legit. Ruled, justified. That's what justification, by the faithfulness of Jesus for all who believe, means.
So it is like inclusion in the covenant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm just going to stop there. That's yeah, questions.
Okay,
It's
so
a lot.
Still wrestling with you, the earthquake on the justification.
Yeah.
Okay, so just following on Cody's point, so
Yeah.
it seems like a two-step process, okay? You just described justification where we become righteous, and then once we're righteous, then through belief in Jesus Christ, we're saved, and from there, that's synonymous with eternal salvation.
That's not what I'm saying.
Well, okay.
Are you saying that that's what I was saying?
No, I'm saying
Oh.
I'm trying to come to an understanding I can actually remember and explain to other people.
Okay, yeah. It might take a little time to work out, but what I'm trying to say is justification is part of salvation. And it's the part of salvation where God says, you are in to the people and you're legit. He says, I've made the ruling in the accusation of unfaithfulness, I've made the ruling faithful because of Jesus. And your faithfulness means that you are a true Israelite. The problem that Paul was answering was, no one's faithful. But because of Jesus, we are called legit. In other words, we're called legit members, we're called legit people of God.
You're saying no one's faithful to the law, but because of Jesus.
Yes. No one's faithful to the law, but Jesus was. So because of him, we are included. He's our new badge of membership. People were trying to get in the club and be like, but I do Sabbath. And he's like, no. Do you have the Jesus membership card?
Well, interesting, the law, it just, not open any other kind of can of worms, but his conversation about law and how it was added, there was a standard before the law was ever there that we completely didn't live up to. So it wasn't just that, well, we didn't live up to the law, therefore we couldn't be good, but like, he makes it pretty clear, it seems, there was a standard that predated the law, and we didn't get it. We fell short. And even the Gentiles who, they had creation, there was a standard they weren't living up to either,
Yes.
even though they didn't have the law.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, in other words, even Abraham needed the covenant, and he was a Gentile.
Yeah.
So all y'all needed God's covenant membership and faithfulness.
Right, but you're still not in it. There's still another step, right?
What do you mean, in meaning going to heaven when you die?
Yeah, right.
Yes, but that's just not the question that they were asking. That's true.
Okay, I'm a Jew.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there
Yeah.
reading Paul, and I know I have righteousness because of the promises to Abraham. So now I'm kind of on the fast track, right? Because I have this, is it imputed righteousness or whichever, and now I believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. Now I have the promise of eternal salvation.
They weren't asking that question, so no. They weren't saying, man, I've really tried to earn my salvation. I can't do it. They were saying, we're already in. We're the Jews. You're out. And the justification is, no, it's a different game we're playing here.
So my problem is
Yeah.
semantics. So I was thinking salvation equals eternal life. And it does it?
Is it covenant and salvation are like sort of a similar thing for the ancient worldview? Is that the idea? Like if you're in the covenant, you're saved. Is that, or what we would put it? It's like you're saved.
People just weren't that concerned about the afterlife as we are, unfortunately, in the first century. That's just, they were a little bit, but that's not their main stuff of life. And it's even more true in the Old Testament.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I got to wrestle with this for a while.
Yeah, wrestle and read some more in N.T. Wright. But John Piper presents the counter argument that says, no, the traditional understanding of Romans is correct. I'm not presenting that to you because this is hard enough. I want you to get, but we've learned a lot about that. So what we're going to do is immerse yourself in this, read Wright, and John Piper can set you to right after that. Thank you all. Thank you all. Have a great week.